Well, thank you, Deborah, and Elisha, thank you for joining us today. It's a real honour to spend time with you talking about the future of our past, I guess. I want to just begin by saying to you and sharing with you personally, like many of the people in our field of Holocaust memory and Holocaust studies, I met your dad many times, and we've always been aware, those of us who are teaching and commemorating and documenting the Holocaust, that the time will come when the memory is passed on to the next generation. I was always had this sense with your father that there was such a sense of immortality about what he said and his presence that it seemed almost inconceivable that towering strength that he had and the way in which he communicated so eloquently the complex, difficult past to those of us who were prepared to listen is no longer here in our presence, and that legacy now is ours to bear, but no one has that legacy more than you. And I would love to start by just asking you about, obviously about your father himself, and what was it like for you as his child to grow up? We saw it from the outside looking in, but from the inside of your experience with him, what was he like as a father, as a person in your home?
First of all, thank you so much, Stephen, for doing this conversation with me. As you know from our conversation before, I'm a great fan of yours and your work, so it's a great honor for me. Look, it was not necessarily easy growing up as the son of the most famous Holocaust survivor in the world. There's a lot one doesn't understand as a kid, and there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is my father, I think, really went out of his way to shield and protect me at a young age. He felt that already I was carrying such a great burden, being the only son of the only surviving son of a family that had been through what it had been through. He felt so much pressure himself, I think, of being last in his line in that sense, and of having a responsibility not only for the broad moral lessons of the Shoah, but very specifically for continuing on the Jewish people. And he felt that there was so much pressure on him and on me. He actually sheltered me quite a bit from knowledge of the Shoah. I can't remember necessarily a single point where I would sit on his lap and he would go into detail and explain to me what happened, but one picks things up in an ambient fashion. When my friends were going to Palm Beach or the Hamptons, for summer or winter vacation, I would be going to visit death camps in Poland. And you start to put two and two together and say, wow, there's a story here and my family is connected to it. More broadly, though, I would say the thing about my father to really note from those of us who knew him up close and personal, we talk in the Jewish faith about Torah shebichtav, the Torah that is written down, and Torah shebe'al peh, the oral tradition. And my father's words are out there to be read in night, in his speeches, in his lectures. But for those of us who got to know my father on a personal level, almost to a person, I hear stories these days of what an incredible listener my father was, how he loved to engage with people and hear their stories, how, in short, he was a mesh. He would, whether it was a taxi driver from Bangladesh, who wanted to explain what each of his 9 kids were doing, or whether it was the person cutting his hair, or whether it was the 70th person online after a lecture who wanted to shake his hand and tell him a story. My father made time for these people and he would listen. So in addition to everything he said, I think it's really how he approached the world from a perspective of listening.
And it's not so well known that your mother survived the Holocaust also. Could you just give us some insight into your mom, and in particular, how your mom and dad together, lived through their memories and their experiences within their home? Because obviously they were, as you expressed just a moment ago, they were not talking to you as their son, or their father wasn't. Was there a different relationship with your mother around this?
Yeah, very much. So first of all, my mom wanted to put the war behind her completely and not think about it ever again. And for her, it was just a set of bad times, bad experience after bad experience. And the sooner she could be done with it and have her new life in America, that's very much where her head was. And my mother's story in brief, she left Vienna very shortly after the Anschluss they were able to escape. My mother actually was in a train, in Germany during Kristallnacht and remembers commotion on the train platforms. They made their way to Belgium for a while until Belgium fell, and then ultimately to France, where they were immediately sent to the Pyrenees. There were certain camps. One of them was called Gours in the southwest. That's where my mother and her sister went, and then my grandfather went to Saint-Cyprien. And amazingly, because they were determined, they were able to escape Gours through bribing guards. My mother's sister was very resourceful. They were able, amazingly, to find my grandfather in Saint-Cyprien. And of course, it's incredibly lucky they did. The inhabitants of Gours were all sent to the camps. And then they hid in Marseille, and then ultimately they made their way through and were smuggled into Basel, where they had family in Switzerland, where they remained for the rest of the war. So she has it's a pretty colorful story, and she was intent to forget as much about it as she could.
And did she ever tell her story to you or to any archive? I know you and I talked about that at some point.
Yeah. For my mother's 90th birthday last year, I was able to get a film crew in and get her to put some of this on tape. But she had avoided it for a long time, and actually, thank God, it's her sister who wrote some extensive journal entries that my cousins were quite fortunate to find and share with me. And that's how we know a lot about the intricacies of what happened in Marseille, how they were saved by a righteous Gentile and his family. And my mother was also too young, I think, to remember some of this clearly. So it was good that we had the older sister writing much of it down.
So you mentioned a few moments ago that you sort of absorbed this through the environment in which you live, but it was never really spoken about. At what point did you become really cognizant of exactly what that history and that you were inheriting was? Was it through reading it in your father's work, or did you?
I think so. I think it must have been the first time I really picked Night Off the Shelf. I must have been maybe 11, 12, and read it cover to cover and was like, whoa, this is my family. These are people I never got to know that I'm reading about what happened to them. And it was a powerful experience for me to all of a sudden put two and two together and understand that there was a story and I could read it.
And did you read his books as they came out, or did you was it not part of your day-to-day world, his writing and his publishing? How did that
First of all,
unfold at the time?
My father wrote 60, 70 books, so I couldn't keep up. It was not possible for me to keep up. Look, I was not, as a young person, once I hit the age of maybe 13, 14, I became pretty determined, maybe a little bit like my mother, that I sort of wanted nothing to do with the old world. And I wanted really a chance to define myself in different ways. I was not interested in being known simply as the son of. I resented very much that I went to a traditional yeshiva where everybody simply saw me as the son of my father and had certain expectations of what that meant for how I should behave and what I should achieve. And I was really sick of it. So I had a very, rebellious teenage life. The last thing in the world I wanted to do was read books by my dad. I was much more interested in my electric guitar and making the acquaintance of girls.
And when did that change, or has that changed? Are you still?
I still playing the guitar. I'm happily married. I think that it changed a bit by bit. I think once I married and had a son and realized that I was going to have a brit milah with my son, that he was going to be entering into the Jewish people, all of a sudden things started changing. Once you have a child, I find that you have a certain sense of your place in history and your responsibility to history that one does not necessarily have as a young adult. I'm not saying other young adults don't have it, many do. I did not. But all of a sudden, having a family of my own that I was responsible for and thinking about what connectivity and continuity did I want them to feel changed my world pretty substantially.
And how long ago was that at this point, Elisha?
My son was born in 2005.
Right, so over the period, your father passed away, I think, in 2016?
Yes.
So how has your, I want to say, role changed in respect of his memory and his legacy since his passing? Because I remember him as a very forceful presence, or whenever Eddie Wiesel was there, you know it. And I just felt that real sense of his presence. I can only imagine now, within your own family, what the absence of his presence must be for you. How has that memory passed on to you and to your son in this sort of chain that you described a moment ago?
Look, it's a great question. If you had told me 20 years ago that I would be studying a page of Talmud every day, not just for me, but so that my son and daughter will have the experience of coming home from school and seeing their father engaged in Jewish texts, I would have said, you're crazy. That's never going to be me. Absolutely not. And if you would have told me that not only am I going to do the things that my father did at his Shabbos dinner table, but I'm actually going to be doing more, singing more Zmiros, davening the full Birkat HaMazon out loud, the entire way through, I would have said never. But, it's there came a turning point where I realized that there was joy in passing on knowledge and faith and tradition onto the next generation. And then all of a sudden it became very easy. And I want my kids to go out into the world knowing where they come from and knowing that it's not a burden, knowing that it's not a whole set of negative consequences. I would say that, in our home we talk, much less about the Shoah and much more about Judaism itself and what it means to be Jewish and what it means that we have family in Israel and a whole host of other issues that bring joy and intellectual challenge and thinking. And I don't want my kids to just say, oh yeah, I'm Jewish because I have to, because I feel all this guilt and all of these people died and therefore X, Y, Z. That's not the way I want them approaching it. I want them to have an experiential sense of who they are. I want them to remember how it felt to be growing up at our Shabbos dinner table, not necessarily any argument or justification for why they should do what they need to do.
You and I have had a chance to talk about the environment in which we're living today, Elisha, with anti-Semitism on the rise. Our many friends in the UK will be familiar with that, but we here in the United States have been seeing a rise in anti-Semitism, and particularly anti-Zionism, which is very much on the rise on campuses around the USA and in other areas. And I know that you've been on the forefront of trying to counter that. Could you just talk to us about why you've chosen that particular pathway and cause, and been so active and so present in that the challenge that we're facing right now?
Listen, we have to remember we've been murdered by the fascists and we've been murdered by the communists. Neither particularly care for Jewish identity and our way of thinking and our way of being. And when I look at the landscape of anti-Semitism in our country, obviously it's an incredible tragedy when you have Charlottesville and the chanting of Jews will not replace us. It's an incredible tragedy that you have the shootings in Pittsburgh and in Poway. But in some cases, it's easier to see a crazy Nazi coming because what they're spouting is crazy and it's understood to be crazy, and the media appropriately attacks it, and all of the different armaments of Western civilization are there to protect us from it. Anti-Semitism that comes from the left is much more insidious because it's worked its way into the academy. It's become acceptable to make Jewish students feel uncomfortable on college campuses. It's been accepted to spout lies and to have slogans that effectively call for the end of the Jewish right to peace and security in the Middle East. And all of that has become okay under the cause of social justice. And this is a theme I've been thinking about a lot lately, which is, what is it that allows the lie to occur? And when I speak about the lie, I'm going to be very clear and bold in stating what I think the big lie is right now in the United States. The big lie is Jews are white, Palestinians are black. That is the big lie. And how do you get to a place where that big lie becomes acceptable? And I think it has to do with a moving away from specificity and a moving towards generalities. our world has become so complicated, and there are so many people in the social media, framework looking to exacerbate and polarize, that I think what's happened is it just becomes easier to say, yeah, good guys and bad guys, let's divide it all up, and we don't have to think too hard about it. Let's just sort of do it, and these are the way that the cards are going to fall, and people aren't doing their own thinking anymore, they aren't researching their own facts. And my father believed very much in the uniqueness of the Holocaust. And he also believed in the uniqueness of the Rwandan genocide. And he also believed in the uniqueness of the Armenian genocide. He never wanted to say, you only look at one. He always said you have to look at all of these different points of pain in the world, but you can't compare suffering. And I think right now what's happening is we become intellectually lazy in the United States, quite frankly, and that's why we succumb to these big lies. And we don't see the nuance in each and every story. We just tell us, who are the good guys and bad guys, make it easier for us. Sorry, that was long.
No, that's a great answer, and actually I think it's good for our British audience just to get that nuance in terms of the difference in the way in which particularly anti-Semitism from the left wing of the political spectrum is differentiated somewhat from what you might experience in Britain, insofar as it is about race here. And that the history of America plays very strongly into that, because essentially the anti-Zionist cause that is being promoted, particularly on college campuses, is about aligning, we call the BIPOC, all of the minority groups on campus behind the cause of the Palestinians, and all of those groups are either mainly about race and somewhat about gender and sexuality. But what happens is the Jewish student body gets excluded from that, because they are seen to be white and privileged and aligned with Israel, as against the Palestinians, who are seen to be, as you put it rightly there, black and of color, and persecuted and excluded, like those who feel that those in that same group here in the United States who are struggling for their own form of identity and or liberation from other forms of discrimination. And it becomes extremely difficult to unpick that, because these two get aligned, and it's manipulated extremely well, I have to say, on the part of those who are anti-Semitic, and because college campus students just don't have the political chops to be able to untangle all of that, and they fall into that trap, leaving Jewish students extremely vulnerable. So I wanted to say thank you for you taking up that cause. It's really interesting that you mentioned the sense that your father had of justice in the world. I remember him talking about Bosnia at the time as well, when that was still going on, and he was very outspoken about that. And at the time, my brother James and I founded the Holocaust Centre in the UK, and was struggling to figure out, how do we speak about genocide in the world? And in fact, his voice was extremely helpful to us, because when we saw somebody of his stature being able to speak truth and be able to speak with such clarity, that's when we actually created the Aegis Trust, which is a genocide prevention agency at the UK Holocaust Centre, in order to be able to deal with those, talk about those contemporary issues. And Elisha, we've got some questions coming in. I'm just going to thank you very much for those of you who are posing questions to Elisha, because I'll field a few of those as they come in. So here's an interesting question from Denise. How might it feel for you, Elisha, if your children become rebellious also and want to turn their backs on the Jewish experience and traditions that you wish to impart to them?
Gosh, karma's a bitch, right? I mean, I probably deserve it. Look, I think all I can do is what I can do, right? And I feel that I've made a strategic choice, which is I'm putting all my chips on joy. I want them to feel joy when they engage with Jewish experience. Who knows? Maybe I should have done a little bit more guilt. Maybe I should have done. Overall, I feel very confident on the bet I've made. If they depart, from that, I think what I'm going to aspire to be is as patient as my father was with me, and to understand that, who a young person is at age 13 or 16 is not who they will be when they're 22 or 25, and is not who they're going to be, when they're 49, like I am. I think my father, would he be shocked that I'm studying Talmud every day, or did he know it all along? I have no way of knowing. What I do know is that he treated me with love and patience and embraced whatever direction I was going in. He just laid certain boundaries, and I think that there are certain boundaries that I will impose as well for my children, and explain to them that they become definitional for the parent-child relationship. What are the boundaries my father asked me to do? Number one, he said I have to marry Jewish. He said, this is just a red line. I have to marry Jewish. And he didn't care if it was someone who converted in, as long as it was kahalacha. He didn't care if it would be Sephardi, Ashkenazi, what color their skin would be. The only thing that mattered to him was that I marry Jewish and do my role in perpetuating the Jewish people. The only other thing he really asked of me was to say Kaddish for him when he passed. And of course, I made a great mistake in this, in that I had thought that he was asking me to do him one last favor. And what I realized in the midst of my Kaddish year was actually this was him doing me a final last favor. So those were the only two things that he really asked of me, and I'm probably going to ask the same things of my children.
And was it that Kaddish year that brought you closer to Judaism and your sort of sense of Jewish identity and continuity?
I think I was already on the path, but it certainly accelerated it quite a great deal, because the thing about saying Kaddish, particularly if you're not going to be at the same exact synagogue. I was traveling internationally on business all the time, and sometimes you end up in a Reform synagogue, sometimes in a Chabad, sometimes in a conservative synagogue. You have to build up a certain level of literacy to figure out where you fit. And the news is you do fit. The person who says Kaddish, the mourner, has a profound role in every service. And my literacy increased pretty radically in that year.
Seeing that little note here from Tanya. Thanks, Tanya, for commenting. She said, good for you, Elisha. It's so important to be your own person. Smiley face. What does it mean to be your own person and also be the son of Elisha Wiesel?
It's a great question. Look, my father always believed in seeing me pursue my passions. He never understood why I would want to work on Wall Street or what that would be about. But once I did, he was very excited and had a million questions about the people and who was I close with and was I moving in the right direction. And even when I was doing things he really disapproved of, he tolerated them. So I think to be one's own person is to follow one's passion. What more do we want for our children or for ourselves than to find things we are passionate about, to learn and study and grow and to pursue those. And I'm very cognizant of the fact that my father was unique. And it's always in the forefront of my mind that even if I choose to pursue some of the same projects that my father did, human rights activism, defending the Jewish people when we're under attack, I do it with a very different skill set and different experience set than my father had. I'm never going to be able to have the weight, the moral authority that comes from having been there in Auschwitz and seen, the darkest of nights. I can't, nobody can. But I have different skills and different perspectives and things that I've learned that my father did not have. So I made my peace with that.
There's a lot of discussion right now, and I know this will be very pertinent to many of our audience today, about what does it mean to be the inheritors of this memory, whether second or third, now getting into fourth generation. What sort of roles might one take up in order to be able to continue the memory? There's, in some senses, in your father's case, there is no question about the continuation of his memory. His books line every library shelf in every library of the world, that's secure. So, your mom's story is maybe not so secure in terms of being public. I've talked to many, second and third generation who are now taking up that role of being the, if you like, carrying the memory forward. What advice would you have for our audience about how do you think about that in terms of your, being the carrier of your parents' memories into the next generation?
I want to make sure I understand how specifically do I understand my responsibility with regards to my mother's story?
I think actually I'd like you to talk about both, because what's happened to, I think, because of the fame that your father achieved through his writing and his communication, his story dominates. But your mother's story is equally part of the memory that is precious for the future within your family, I would imagine, but also generally, because every survivor has a story to tell, and all those stories are important. And this is coming down now to the next generations, which is what this whole convening is about. How should we be thinking about that? I'm saying we, I'm including myself in this, but those of us who are the inheritors of memory.
I think experiential is the best way. So in 2018, my son had his bar mitzvah, and we asked him, "Where do you want to go?" And he had a conversation with my mom, and he came back and he said, "I want to go to Vienna. I want to see where my grandmother grew up." And we ended up putting together an amazing trip. We went to Vienna as a family. We found, my wife is very persuasive. We were able to get into her apartment and go to the window where she would look out her window. And my mom sat there for a little bit, and I got some audio recordings of her speaking. And from Vienna, we saw the corner where she and her father watched the Nazis march in. And then from Vienna, we went to Gurs. We saw the camp where she was held. We went from there to Basel and got to see where she spent her, early, teenage years. So I think that there's nothing like doing the stuff experientially. Like if one can do that, if one can go with a survivor and the next generation and help build that link, it's incredibly powerful.
So if you look forward in terms of what happens next in the Wiesel family, what are you anticipating you will do with, this memory in terms of your own personal life? The memory of the memories that both your mother and father have left for the world in their own different ways.
Gosh, it's sort of a big open question. I mean, there's what do I want to do with my parents' foundation? My father left behind a foundation, the Elisha Wiesel Foundation. I'm thinking very carefully about that. What do I want to do with my parents' legacy as Zionists? What do I want to do with my father's legacy as a practicing Jew of faith? These are all complex things that sort of unfold day by day. And there are points of tension within each, as I suspect each of us encounter in our own journeys. I don't know if you want to double click.
Well, I think Erica here is asking a similar sort of question in a way, and maybe she's doing a better job than me at this. Okay. She says, "Does your worthwhile bet on Jewish study and life and joy exclude your very special position as the son of such an important father in keeping alive the remembrance of the results of anti-Semitic hate and the Holocaust?" It's an interesting question, Erica. Thank you for that.
I'll try to answer as directly. No, they don't exclude each other at all. It's just a question of what I prioritize within my own family. But I'm here speaking to you today because, as a general matter, when I get approached and asked to speak on Holocaust memory or about my father's legacy, for the most part, I try to say yes, and I try to find a way to make it happen. I don't have my own program. I'm a big believer in the world doesn't need redundancy when there are very expert people already doing the job. I think Facing History does an excellent job of producing curriculum that teach about genocide and the consequences. I don't want to replicate Facing History. I would like to find a way to partner with them. I think there are other groups out there that do amazing work in their own fields. How can I ever try to do what the ADL is doing? How can I ever try to do what any of these groups are doing on my own? But I can find ways to partner with them. I make myself available. I feel like I've put up a flag and says, I'm here if anybody wants to come to me. And this summer I had a very interesting experience in July where I did something I'd never done before. And I learned what it meant to be a political organizer. And this was at the time in late May, Operation Guardians of the Walls. If you'll remember, Hamas had started shooting rockets into Tel Aviv and into Sderot. And I was dumbfounded at the lack of response by American Jewish leadership. I couldn't believe that we were not rallying on the streets to show solidarity with our fellow brothers and sisters in Israel. And ultimately, I decided that, even if it's not going to be the biggest thing ever, I got to try. And I went around to ultimately over 60 or 70 American Jewish groups and was able to get a fair representation together for a rally in front of the U.S. Capitol. And that was an interesting moment for me.
You won't know this, but I tried in vain to persuade your father to do a testimony for the Show Foundation. I sat in his office many times.
You never did that?
Never did it. And it was interesting because you talked a little bit about the different forms of Torah learning earlier. And his response to me always was, my legacy's in the written word. And eventually we called it a truce and we left it in the end. But I'd love to know from you, do you have a book of his that reached you in a particular way, or that, stuck with you, or something that he wrote that is most meaningful to you?
It's hard to pick. I mean,
yeah.
the stories of Hasidism in Souls on Fire are among my favorite. Mm-hmm. My father approached, his beloved Hasidic rabbis with such love and fervor. But when I was in my 20s, my favorite was actually The Accident, because all of a sudden I saw my father as a relatable person in his, young life, turning his back on Judaism, rebelling, dating non-Jewish women, eating treif, doing whatever he was doing. And I was like, wow, my father went through that as well, a period of going far. So that was my favorite work of his. Just recently, I haven't read all his books, I'm going to confess. So some of these are books I've never read before. I'm preparing myself for next week. Next week on Tuesday, something quite unusual is happening. And I wasn't necessarily fully in favor of it, but it's happening. Which is that the U.S. National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. is unveiling a bust, a statue of my father in the church, alongside Mother Teresa and Rosa Parks and other American heroes, I guess, or human rights heroes. And I went and I was like, I need to read up a little bit to understand how my father thought about the church. So I found the oath and devoured it in an afternoon. And was just entranced by the story of the pogrom, led on by the priest, the relationships between the Jews and Christians, how they prepared themselves, for it. So I'm sort of continually, I'm very lucky as a son who's mourning, a father who's passed. How many children, whenever they want to hear, their ancestors speak on something, can just pull a book off the shelf on so many topics and be spoken directly to. It's a great blessing.
I'm a theologian by training, which something about it turned out to be, an interesting and challenging discipline to study when it comes to the Holocaust. And I remember as a young person just confronting the Holocaust and my own faith as a Christian and trying to figure out where do I fit into all of this. Just when I read his the trial and just sort of saw how he handled so beautifully the complexity of theodicy, it was how do you build into a simple story something so complex was really what he was the master at, because at the end of it you didn't really necessarily process all of the complexity, but you didn't need to either. That it could take you into a journey of discovery that left you more at peace with what you were confronting, which is, most of what he wrote about was highly confronting from both a human history and theology and personal, responsibility perspective, and yet left you feeling more empowered to be able to understand what is, in many cases, very difficult to understand. I think that was the power of his communication skills. And as we come towards the end of our program today, one of the things I think we're all thinking about is the history of the Holocaust. Is something now which is receding into the past. I always emphasize and continue to emphasize that until the last Holocaust survivor is no longer with us, this is the generation of the Holocaust, and it's our responsibility to make sure that the stories are documented and told, and that we don't take on that sort of mantle too early and sort of dismiss that generation as if they are here. They are here and they are present, and yet at the same time that transition is taking place. As we think about that, what do you think the Holocaust is coming to mean in our contemporary society, and how should we think about it in a world in which, we talked about anti-Semitism, but a world in which racism and genocide and many forms of ethnic hatred continue to persist? How can it help to guide us? Can it help to guide us? And how should we think about that without losing the paucity of the memory and the necessary memory of the Jews who were murdered because they were Jews in Europe in the 1930s and 40s?
Listen, it's a searing flame we have to keep alive in our hearts. This happened. This happened to people we know. It happened to our parents, our aunts, maybe our grandparents at this point. It's not something that's so infinitely far away, and it's so well documented at this point. It's a crime that has testimony upon testimony, photograph upon photograph. And look, the work that you do, Stephen, and so many of the folks in this room and our sponsoring organizations have done is critical, and who am I to teach you how to do it better? You know how to do it. But I will tell you that, I still am hearing fresh stories that shock me and move me from Holocaust survivors. I was on stage a few years ago with this lovely woman who was telling the story of how she escaped the Nazis by hiding in a barrel full of coal. And then she had to hide under a bench at the Umschlagplatz, where the last train was going to Treblinka. These stories are still coming out, and they're amazing. And I think you're right. We have to do whatever we can to give a platform to this generation and get them to speak and encourage them to and love them as they do and make them feel very secure and safe.
Well, thank you. It's actually really amazing what you say there. I just spent over the weekend the entire day. I keep thinking that I'm never going to hear another news story about the Holocaust, and this gentleman was from Pristina in Kosovo, walked out of, with his parents, the deportation center at Monopol in Macedonia. All 7,200 Jews of Macedonia were murdered, more or less, except their family. They were literally walked out of it, went to Albania and pretended to be Muslims and lived in a Muslim community throughout the war. I have never heard a story like it. To boot, he spoke Ladino. So I conducted my first interview ever in Ladino without speaking a word of Ladino. And so it's just amazing. And I want to thank the Association of Jewish Refugees for bringing us together, Elisha, today. It's really great to talk to you, but also, most importantly, for the work they've done for generations at this point to ensure that those who did survive have been looked after and cared for, and that as we move forward into the future, that we think about how we carry this memory forward together. So AJL, thank you so much for bringing us together. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I miss you all back in Britain, and I'll be back in Blighty sometime soon, I am sure. But in the meantime, I want to say thank you, Elisha Wiesel, for being with us and for your insights in so many ways today.
Thank you. Good luck to everybody.